Welcome, everybody, and I am so glad to have Josh Sandoz available with us today. He is the curator of the International Therapist Directory. He's a licensed mental health counselor, and I'm Ray Barrett, the CEO of the Telehealth Certification Institute. And today we're going to focus on providing psychotherapy when a client is in another nation or internationally. The website, the International Therapist Directory, is designed to assist with that and locating psychotherapists in different countries and connecting with different therapists across the globe. It's an online global listing for professional therapists, counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists interested in providing culturally sensitive, cross-cultural treatment and care for today's international expat community. There's over 250 therapists in at least 40 countries listed in that directory. The directory was established in 2009 by Josh Sandoz, who we have here with us, under the auspices of Interaction International, a nonprofit organization founded by David Pollock, PhD, and the co-author of Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds. A year later, the directory became an independent website, which Josh continues to oversee. Josh is an adult third culture kid, a therapist, and the former director of the Child and Family Support Services with Interaction International. He resides in Seattle, Washington, where he has a private practice. And glad to hear that you are in Seattle, because I, over the summer, took my family on a kind of a cross-country trip.
Oh, really?
So we're in New York, and we flew out to San Francisco, and we rented a minivan, drove all the way up to Seattle. And then back. We loved it. It was fantastic.
Did you go up the Oregon coast?
Yes. Yep. California, Oregon coast,
Yeah.
Washington.
Yeah. Special place.
Yes, it is. I was blown away by it's just beach line forever, full public access.
Yeah.
And then just forest after forest. I mean, the forest just goes on forever, and tons of parks, one after the other. I was blown away. My wife says, she goes, if you ever go missing, I'll know where you are. I'll know where to find you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the International Therapist Directory website. It's a very easy to use website. I like how you have a map here, Josh, where people can easily click on a location and find therapists in that location. They could search by a keyword or name of a therapist or by their location. So I found this very easy to use. And then when they say drill down, let's say if I put in like New York, let's see here. So if I put in New York, you could even drill down further according to specialties of different clinicians.
That advanced filter option off to the right allows you to search by language, by client focus. If you're looking for somebody who works with, say, children of a certain age or adolescents or elder adults, you can search for folks who are only providing online therapy or who provide online therapy, even if they also provide face-to-face therapy somewhere. And by clinical specialty as well. So you can get pretty specific and with the hope that can be a useful tool for folks.
Yeah. And what is meant by traveling? Is that
so traveling, there are a handful of clinicians who are members of the International Therapist Directory who have a model of treatment where they will travel to patients or clients. So, for example, they might be contacted and travel to a certain place for some intensive work. It's usually shorter term work together. But that makes certain opportunities possible that otherwise wouldn't. So
Yeah.
it's a unique model in that there's not too many folks offering that, but for those that do, I think they stay pretty busy.
Yeah. I thought that's what was meant by that. And here locally in my community, there's some postings of a therapist group where they do in-home counseling for families.
Mm.
And I thought that was so cool because
Mm.
it's kind of weird for people, really for anybody, not for everyone, but for a lot of people to go to a therapist's office.
Mm.
So for them to come to the person's home location, I think is great, and especially for families.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're in their own environment, their own comfort and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the online, you're virtually going into their homes or wherever they are at their location. So what got you started in this, Josh?
Mm.
Like, how did you decide to, start this up and continue to maintain it?
Yeah, well, I had completed my master's degree in counseling psychology, and I was working towards my own licensure. I was working at a local psychiatric hospital, doing some work for the graduate school where I had attended. And then I had been involved with Interaction International for, really since 1995, when I attended a transition seminar that David Pollock led for adolescents who had grown up all around the world, returning to the US or Canada for university. And I had a really good experience with Dave and his work. And I began to get involved as a staff member for those transition seminars over the course of the next 10 years or so. And so stayed quite close to folks at that organization. And after I completed my graduate studies, I got involved in a formal way and had that role as the director of Child and Family Support Services. And in that role, we would receive emails from people around the world saying, "Hey, we're Canadian family living in Germany. We're running into a situation where we really would love to meet with a therapist who might understand this whole thing of like we've grown up here and lived there, and now we're here, and all that comes with that kind of lifestyle and experience." And so I started looking online, hoping to find something like an international therapist directory or some kind of resource. And I looked and really scoured the internet as much as I could in a lot of these cases, and I couldn't find certainly nothing that was centralized around this particular theme.
Yep.
And the handful of listings that I did find sometimes appeared wildly out of date. It was really hard to know, is this current information or what's the deal here? So I thought, you know what, there needs to be something like this where there could be one site where therapists who identify as folks who, yes, I have lived this, I understand this, I know a lot about what can come with all of this kind of international mobility, whether it's in childhood or adulthood or both, where those folks can identify and say, oh yeah, I understand what that's about. I love working with people where they're wanting to consider parts of how that way of living has impacted them. So I began to attend some conferences, network with some mental health therapists, and under the umbrella of Interaction International, started this International Therapist Directory in 2009, and it's evolved from there.
Yeah, and have you guys been getting a decent amount of utilization of the site, the directory?
Yeah, the screenshot you had up a minute ago, down at the very bottom, I think you were
Right, it
specifically
shows
on the
views.
yeah
Yeah.
the page you were on specifically. Actually, it's on the bottom of every site. Is a widget I have on here so that everybody can look at this because I think it's really neat to see. And so you can see here that yesterday there were 229 visitors to the site. Over the last month, there's been over 9,000. Since August 31st, 2015, which I think is when I first set this up to begin tracking it on the site, been 330,000 plus visitors. And then you can scroll down and see kind of where a lot of those visitors are coming from.
Yes.
And what I see on here lines up with what I hear from a lot of the members, especially like when you go down into where those visits are coming from. I think the most visits are coming from within the United States. But then after that, the Netherlands is quite high. It seems like a real hub for expat activity and specifically mental health care.
Uh-huh.
Lots of members of the International Therapist Directory located in the Netherlands.
I see.
And lots of people finding them through the directory in the Netherlands. And then you can go on down and see where all else these searches are coming from.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's neat at a glance, and it's continually evolving. It's certainly grown over the years. We
Uh-huh.
just did a massive revamp to the site this last spring. And so with that, it kind of refreshes some of the search engine optimization stuff. So that's been kind of building back up since the spring to make this show up when people are searching using Google or whatever other browser they might be using to try to
Yeah.
find help.
Yeah, and I actually have a friend here in town who he and his family are seriously considering moving soon to another country, either to Italy or Japan, because he works for the military.
Yes.
Well, he works for the VA. He works for the VA. However, it's the military that's looking to hire him back on. Um, Yeah, so I was thinking for my family, it'd be kind of cool to live somewhere, not for 4 years. They're thinking for 4 years. That seems like a long time for me, but for a year. But I would imagine that transition is difficult because we're considering moving again, and even moving to another state or even another town
Yeah.
is a transition for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd imagine internationally, like, man, that could be difficult. I was in Germany. I mean, I was in Belgium for a year, but I would go to Bonn, Germany every weekend to help out at this church where the embassies are. And yeah, so I was kind of in that kind of community. But I guess where I'm going with this is I wonder how many people that seek these services are military versus they're overseas because of work-related stuff, you know?
That's a great question. I actually don't, because of the nature of the way things are set up, when somebody contacts a therapist through the site, they might send them an email, they might reach out to them by phone, they might click through to their specific website and then contact them through means of contact listed on their site. So I don't, and also for confidentiality's sake, I don't track how people who are seeking out therapy, where they're coming from and why. But my hunch, just based on my own experience, is that this community is growing rapidly as the world continues to globalize. And that certainly military families on international or individuals on international assignments could seek this out, but also international business folks, international educators, NGO employees, their children, missionaries and their families,
Yep.
as well as I mean, really anyone who is having experiences that include cross-cultural transition and that mobility piece.
Can
There's
you,
some
can you explain that, the mobility piece, what you mean by that?
yeah, well, I think like you spoke to it a moment ago when you talk about the intensity of transitions in general. And some transitions are much less intense than others, but moving from state to state, uprooting, getting into a whole new school system, it's a massive transition for a family. So some, to stick with the military, for example, some people grow up in military families and they might move every 2 years domestically. So I'll
Right.
stay with the US for the moment, but moving state to state every 2 years, that's an intense amount of high mobility, especially during someone's developmental years. When
Hmm.
that happens in childhood, it kind of sets the stage for, well, this is how life goes.
Right.
This is my sense of normal. Now, when you add the intercultural or cross-cultural dimension to that, it adds complexity and intrigue, and so there for third culture kids, those are individuals who grew up internationally mobile. So they've got a lot of transition. Oftentimes, even if they aren't the ones moving every few years, they might be in communities where people around them are moving all the time.
Uh-huh.
And then there's also the cross-cultural piece where living in country or countries that might be different from their parents identifying country or countries, from their own citizenship. And so as individuals grow up, there can be a lot of kind of exciting benefits that can come from that kind of life, but also some real challenges, and some real challenges specific to that way of living in the world.
Mhm.
A lot of cultural identity questions. Where do I belong? When someone asks, "Hey, where are you from?" How do I even answer that question?
Right.
So things like that.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So, in training clinicians on telemental health, a lot of times I get the question of, can I provide counseling to someone that's overseas for a period of time? And one of the things I talk about is cultural competency.
Mm,
And so sometimes I'll kind of set them up with the question, I'll say, do you think you're culturally competent to provide
mm,
counseling to, say, someone who's doing a year abroad, right?
mm,
Um,
mm,
and they'll say, yeah, sure, because I'm from the same culture that they're from.
mm,
But they don't have any understanding whatsoever of, most likely, of the culture of where the client is at the time, right?
mm.
So if they're moving from, say, New York State over to the Philippines for a year, the clinician might not have any idea of what it's like to live in the Philippines, what it's like to have that cultural clash or cultural integration struggles,
Right.
or whatever it is that the person's going through. Um, so there might be someone better suited for that.
Mm-hmm.
There might not be, but that's something to consider. So I was wondering if you could speak in regards to that, because I have a few questions here. Like, one is like the VA or the
Mm-hmm.
military, right? So they have counselors that provide counseling. I'm not so sure where they are and if they're culturally competent in the culture of where the active military personnel is at the time, and their upbringing. And then culture varies from town to town a little bit, so, and then someone might be living in the Philippines, but they might be on a military base, which is very
Yeah.
different than being in a Philippine
Yeah.
town,
Yeah.
so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit in regards to that in terms of cultural competency, and then how does a clinician even go about assessing their own cultural
Mm.
competency and working with a client? How does that work? And then I assume that there's you kind of spoke to this, that not just cultural competency, but there's also a real skill in helping people with the mobility struggles and living internationally, just in of that in of itself, that transition piece of moving and living somewhere different. There's an understanding that goes along with that's those struggles that you might not have if you haven't had those experiences or investigated that.
Well, I think you articulate a lot of those categories well, and I would add a big one, and that is the return. So say that in your example, the family goes to live in the Philippines for a few years. They've been living in New York up until that point. Yes, it's a massive transition to leave New York, to go through the chaos of the move itself, to get established in the Philippines, to hopefully adjust in ways that they have a life for themselves there. And then when those few years end and it's time for them to go back, say to New York, sometimes that's the even more massive transition. And actually third culture kids have been around for forever, but that particular language for it was coined by Dr. Ruth Useem in the 1950s. She was a sociologist out of the University of Michigan. And she was actually appointed by the US State Department to go to India and observe US citizens who were living there on assignment. And what she found was a couple interesting things. One, she noticed, it wasn't just the US citizens who hung out together. There was this whole expat community where, these folks they're originally from Malaysia, but they've lived in Thailand and now they're here in India. And these folks are from Canada, but now they're here, and they're from Germany, and they're from Argentina. But we kind of all have in common that we're all
outsiders.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that bonds the folks together.
Yeah, like here in Rochester, New York, we have a school for an international school. It's for kids who are from other countries, and they're from Somalia and they're from Syria and from all sorts of countries. And they certainly bond, and then they also have their clashes. So,
absolutely, because there can be that initial we're the same, we're outsiders together, and then you get into the weeds and actually we look at things from radically different perspectives sometimes. But the other significant piece, there were lots of significant pieces, but another big one that Dr. Useem discovered, she followed the families then back to the United States when they transitioned back. And in most of the cases, maybe mom and dad had grown up themselves in the US. This was maybe their first significant experience living outside of the country. And so when they returned back to the US, certainly they had been deeply impacted by their experiences living in India, and in some ways forever changed as a result. But for the parents, there was a sense of, and now we're returning home. For the kids, that was not the case. For the kids, there was a sense of, I think I'm leaving home to go somewhere that used to be my home, but doesn't feel like that anymore. And maybe it still is in some way. It was way more ambiguous and a lot more complexity. So that's another piece, the transition back somewhere for an individual, for families. Sometimes for those adults, it can be a real gut punch when there is that thought I'm going home now, and they return, and yes, they are, but they may underestimate the ways that they've been impacted by their experience over those few years, or underestimate how that place and the people there have changed over the few years. And so there can be I think I should be able to slip right back into life as I knew it, but suddenly everything feels different and I'm not quite sure how to do this. Plus all of the grief that comes with all of the, there's so many gains with this kind of life, but also a lot of grief around the losses. And So to circle back to your question for assessing some of this, I think, I mean, part of how I've set up the directory is that I have a clear kind of membership statement that those who sign up to be members are to agree to in order to be part of the directory. And really, it is it is kind of an honor system of sorts. Like, I'm not trying to go through and really vet the depth of the cultural competency and say, like, oh, you fell this short, or like, oh yeah, you should teach courses about this. So I rely on folks, and my hope is that therapists have done a good amount of their own work, getting to know themselves really well, and can and maybe have had this lived experience themselves, either as adult third culture kids, or where they've lived as expats or are living as expats. And so they kind of, they know it in their bones, for one thing, is my hope. But also there's been an increasing amount that's been written about like the third culture kid experience, resources for expats. And so providing more language so that clinicians and any of us can think with greater depth about our experiences. So that's some of how that's set up to kind of ask the therapist, do you acknowledge that you feel comfortable and this is an area for you, and for them to say, yes, this is for me.
Yeah. So say a clinician has lived abroad, is familiar with what it's like to have to go through these kind of transitions. Would they be appropriate to be listed for many of these different locations, even though they've never themselves lived in those locations? Or is it that clinicians listed in these different locations on the map are quite familiar with the culture of those locations? Or is it both and? Like, how does...
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think with each individual, like, I'll use maybe myself and my own practice as an example, because I can speak to that with more nuance. A lot of folks I work with have lived or live in places that I myself have lived or lived, but others maybe have lived in lots of different places. And some of the places I have a high degree of familiarity with, some of which I don't have as high a degree of familiarity. But I have studied culture and done a lot of thinking about how to try to think through cultural lenses, cultural values, cultural identity. And so some of the work is helping somebody do their own, kind of grow their own ability to notice the different parts of themselves and how they interact and how they relate to themselves. But it requires a good amount of humility. I think I myself, as deep as I've gone into this and keep going, I think anyone who's in any kind of cross-cultural field, if they ever claim or try to say that, oh yeah, I know the ins and outs of all culture, like, no, nobody does. And so I think, like in those cases, it's very important for me to acknowledge my limitations and to kind of work with someone around, hey, there may be parts of your experience here that we'll need to work together to lean into some understanding. So some of it's the awareness. I think it's really valuable to be aware of what you don't know. So if someone has had a deep experience in a culture that I have no personal experience with. I might know a lot about the transition side of things. I might know some general things about, is that, does that culture lean towards being more individualistic or more collective in terms of how to, I can use my like book knowledge about how does hospitality work in that culture, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it then comes alive in working with someone. So tell me, what's it like when you were living there? What were the you were 8 years old when you were there. What were the attitudes about children in that part of the world? So even just being able to ask that kind of question, not knowing is important, because if I just assume, well, we've probably had the same experience, or even if I assume, well, I know what they experience, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
so to open that up and get into, well, what were the attitudes? How did society view children? Were they to be seen and not heard, or were they kind of lifted up as the center of every social gathering? Or and then when you layer some of the complexity um, around race or gender identity, and like, so what was it like to be part of a dominant culture that, like, if you were a child who has white skin and go to a school where you're one of a handful of other white children, what are the attitudes towards you as an individual? Was there, even though you were in a minority status, was it a privileged minority? Were those who are white looked at as
Mm-hmm.
superior due to white supremacist mindsets that can be found all around the world and in all of us? And so to be able to tease out some of that and really get into the weeds, I think having a lot of familiarity with as much kind of ways that culture works is really useful, but also having a lot of humility and valuing what we don't know, being aware of what we don't know, comes in really handy. And I think just one other thought on this, and Dave Pollock used to say something like this, that the idea that cultures are incredibly different, and people tend to hold a lot in common. So
Uh-huh.
some of our core needs as humans might be very similar, and then how they get expressed or played out can look really different depending on the cultural context.
Sure.
So if we have a need to connect, that might look really different in different parts of the world. So some of it's just having that view to say, like, oh, what's going on underneath here? Is this about a need to connect that at some level is just a human thing,
Yeah.
even though it looks different?
Yeah. So therapists are going to have to assess um, whether or not they provide services to a client or not. So like a lot of those that I train, they're Americans. They've always lived in America. But then they'll have someone who's international for a period of time or some sort of situation in regards to that. And then they'll have to assess, hey, am I possibly the best fit for that person? So do I provide services, or do I look elsewhere? Do I look to refer this person to someone who specializes in living internationally, or as is familiar with the culture of where they're living? Any advice in terms of how a clinician would make that assessment, go about making that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be similar in terms of other, it's comparable to other types of clinical specialties. If a clinician has a lot of experience working with someone who's experiencing an eating disorder, when somebody contacts them and says, hey, this is going on for me and I want to do some work together, there's probably a sense of like, okay, this is a natural fit. And even if maybe they've had a lot of experience with individuals who that's expressed in more of a bulimic sort of way as opposed to a withholding sort of way, there's some crossover there. But if it's a clinician who it's like, well, I really haven't worked with many people who have experienced that, and I had some classroom experience with it and came across it in my internship once, but that's about it. Like a responsible therapist is probably going to say, you know what, this is, I know two other people that I can refer you to who they have a lot of experience in this area. And so I think it's similar with what you're talking about here. And what I really appreciate about what you're saying is I hear you and your training trying to bring to people's attention that, hey, you need to think about this in the same way. There was a time when children who are adopted into families, it was just kind of not on anyone's radar to really think about how having that kind of experience could impact someone. And at a certain point, we started to catch on and realize, oh, there's something about this experience and there's some continuity that can show up. And so if someone mentions like, oh, well, I was adopted, there's a natural like, okay, well, let's lean into what was that like? And let's explore this and open it up. And I think what I hear you doing is just highlighting, hey, if someone has some cultural complexity to their upbringing, if they've had a lot of high mobility, they've had both, for the therapist, they need to say, okay, wait a second, this is a whole realm unto itself that if I don't really know what this is about, to assume that I do is pretty unhelpful. And those are the cases where it's like, you know what, I don't have the experience. I need to reach out to someone who might.
Yeah. And then using your directory, it's very like, I don't recommend therapists unless I really know them, right? Because, some therapists are great and then some are not. So
yeah, it's like any profession.
Yeah. So your site is a great resource where clinicians, if they have someone looking for psychotherapy, but they're in another country, they can find someone. However, I guess in terms of, assessing, who's going to be a good fit for this person and who's not, I was wondering if you have any advice in terms of how a clinician would go about that, finding a good fit for a client looking for services.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes, and I still run into this, the original situation from 10 years ago, sometimes even with the directory, and it has been growing over the years, and I hope it will continue to, but sometimes people do write to me, they find the site, they say, hey, I'm in a certain part of the world. I just looked, the nearest person listed is like 400 miles away. Like, what can I do? And then I might direct them to like, well, if it's an option for you, there are a number of folks who are listed as practicing online. And so that would be a way to at least begin to look and like who's in a similar time zone or something like, or maybe they grew up in the country that you grew up. But all that to say, sometimes there's the small town phenomenon, even in major cities, where if someone's in a part of the world where therapy isn't widely available, maybe there's one or two folks that these are my options if I want to see someone face to face. So kind of starting there. But the more ideal situation is that there are more and more options. so that somebody can find what's a good enough fit for the work, and not just hope that the one person who's nearby is going to be. And so to that, I think I thought about this a lot in first putting the directory together and structuring it over time. And I decided to kind of go the route of trying to include and to ask the members to include information about themselves that at least gives people looking for a therapist an initial frame of reference to go with. So they can read about whatever someone describes to put in their description about themselves and how they work. They can see the kind of clinical specialties and some of the experience they've had. They can go to that person's website if they have one and learn more about them that way. See what languages they practice in. Learn about some of their cross-cultural background. And then the contact information's there to reach out. So say somebody finds 4 or 5 people that, well, these all seem like they might be good, then they can take it from there. So it's kind of set up like the old-fashioned phone book. I don't think any of us get phone books anymore, but where it really is meant to be a resource. And kind of like you said, like if I need a plumber and I open the phone book and there's 14 plumbers, I don't know which ones I can trust or can't. And it'd be great if I have a personal recommendation. But as the phone book, all the plumbers have a chance to say, this is who I am, this is my contact number. And then it is up to me to call them. And if I don't feel good about who picks up on the other line, I don't think that's the one for me. I'm going to call somebody else. I wish, I think what you were saying of the personal referrals goes such a long way. And so the secondary purpose of the directory, like the primary purpose is to help people looking for culturally sensitive therapists in this regard get connected to those folks. But the secondary purpose is to provide avenues for the therapists themselves to interact. So we have a listserv that those therapists can join and email one another. We have quarterly newsletters. Therapists can post blog posts on the site as members. And so it's a way for therapists to get to know one another, because just because someone is practicing in Paris and working with somebody there, maybe someone they're working with is now moving to Mexico City and they are needing to make a referral. And if these relationships can form even online over time, like, I've read some stuff by this clinician in Mexico City, contact this person, it gets it that much closer to that ideal that you're talking about of like, oh, I know this person and I trust how they treat people and how they work.
Yeah, that makes sense a lot. Yeah, those listservs are very helpful, and even like actually reaching out to the person, give them a call.
Yeah.
And big piece of this work internationally too is standard of care, not just with cultural competency, but with standard of care with emergency management planning, care coordination, being able to make referrals and know what resources are available locally for the client, knowing what the law is and the regulations around providing services in that jurisdiction. So I'd imagine, connecting with people that are English speaking and in that area could help fill in those gaps, or simply provide the service, maybe be the best fit to be providing that service.
Yeah, and sometimes those are the questions that come up. If someone's been living and practicing in the UK and they're going to make a move to Germany, it's useful as the therapist for them to reach out to some other expat therapists in Germany and say, hey, I'm about to make this transition. Any tips? Where do I start? How do I make sure that I'm above board in terms of my licensure and getting settled and
Yeah.
all the things. So that's a hope, and that's been growing over time. The online communities can kind of ebb and flow in terms of activity, but my goal was to create some pathways and avenues for that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. And do people find any challenges in doing this kind of work? So like, those that I train is telemental health. So using technology. From what I hear, the technology has been working really well. It's definitely really improved a lot, but there's still glitches. You're still using the internet over an ocean or
Mm-hmm.
long distances. So do you get feedback from people in terms of challenges in providing this kind of work, specifically online and internationally?
Yeah, I think there are those who do a lot of the online work and have a high comfort level and have. I know there was a former member of the International Therapist Directory named Roy Huggins, and he's out of Portland, Oregon, speaking of the Northwest here.
Yeah.
And he developed a company called Person Centered Tech and tries to really help therapists who want to do a lot of this kind of work, get into the deep weeds of like, okay, if you're working with folks out of this country, here's what pops up a lot with the internet connection. And so you might go with this particular HIPAA approved online medium. For others, this other works well.
Platform. Yep.
So there, I know, and you probably know with your background, a lot of those details, things that I have done some selective online work, but I'm pretty selective about it because I do most of my work face to face, and so just personally, and so I've kind of learned as I needed to around very particular situations and tried to find something that works. So some of the challenges that come up, I think, are for more folks like me who it's not what we're doing all the time. And so it's the initial like, okay, let's try this out.
Yeah.
We use this. We know it's HIPAA approved. We've kind of got what we need on board, but then we really have to find out, well, what's the connection actually like?
Right.
And if there's a problem on a given day, what's our backup plan? And can we still meet even if all of a sudden the signal is not good? Those I think are the most common, just those kind of technical glitches. And that, depending on how someone works, that can be really disruptive, especially if you're getting into really something really sensitive with somebody. And then the picture freezes. And,
like, you don't want that.
Yeah. So I think some of the technical challenges are still an issue. But improving all the time. I mean, it really is incredible what's possible.
Yeah, definitely. And I know some people get concerned about like legal liability.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not aware of any professional liability insurance providers, that cover international work. Not that they don't exist, but I'm not aware of any.
Right.
Or if on your listserv, or if you're aware of those kind of any of those kind of issues in terms of legal liability, professional liability insurance, if there's been any legal cases for people being sued or civil court and so forth for practicing internationally.
I'm not aware of any cases off the top of my head, but this question is probably one of the top, maybe the top, definitely top 3 questions that come up in the listserv, because I think there is this wish that, well, can I just set up shop anywhere and work with anyone, anytime, all around the world? And the short answer is no. Like, the laws are different in every single country, and they're different around every licensing board. And so even it might be different for you practicing out of New York and me practicing out of Washington.
Yeah, the United States makes it very complicated.
Absolutely.
With
And so,
yeah.
so the wisdom of the listserv, and some of the folks who do a lot of this have done an incredible amount of research and gotten into it. And I can't speak to the details myself, but the ones who I think have done the most research say, you gotta just do the work each and every time. And so if you're in France and you're working with someone in Japan, you need to find out what are the laws from your licensure perspective and where you are. What are the laws in Japan? Is this above board? Is it not? And then, like in any profession, there's a certain amount of risk tolerance that any of us have in doing this kind of work. Because I think we're in a gray area. I mean, the law is very black and white, but the reality on the ground is there's complexity that the world's changing pretty rapidly, and there are questions here that don't fit into some of how the laws have been conceived. And I think the laws will probably adapt over time, but we have to think through, from my perspective, okay, ethically, what is my role here? And sometimes law and ethics are hand in hand, and sometimes there's some tension and some conflicts. And when it feels like, ethically, yes, this person has moved. They're in a place where, to their knowledge, to my knowledge, there isn't someone locally for them to work face to face. Maybe I'm still researching the legality of trying to work from a distance. But in the meantime, ethically, I don't feel right about just saying, well, we can't meet anymore. And so maybe I decide I'm going to take on the risk. We're going to continue to try to meet. Or maybe I don't. And that's something that is very personal and has to be weighed through. Right. And then hopefully, ideally, over time, there are feedback loops and ability to, within our profession, have an impact on how these laws continue to be shaped over time, for the sake of working with an increasingly globalized world.
Yeah, that ethical dilemma comes up a lot for people, because people are so mobile. They travel so much and so far when they do travel. This has been very, very helpful, and I'm really glad that people have this resource available. So you also have blog posts. And like you said, if they become a member, they can get on the listserv.
Ray, if you click on the upper left-hand box, the International Therapist Directory, right
here,
that'll take you to the home page.
Okay.
And it has you can scroll down and see some of the highlights for the blog post. It shows the network of therapists on the map there. So people can zoom in, and there's different icons showing like who's practicing online, who's practicing in person. So people can access the information in a lot of different avenues, just depending on what feels most intuitive to them. And then you can go down and see some of the recent blog posts, some of the members who have either recently joined or renewed their membership. So those are some of the other site features. And it's been very exciting. The site keeps evolving. We're in our 10th year. And when I say we, it really is the royal we. I do this under the umbrella of my own private practice because it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. And I plan to continue to offer it and try to improve the site for years and decades to come. It allows me to stay connected to an international community of folks. Personally, that's incredibly meaningful. And so it's been a very exciting project. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Josh. I definitely appreciate it. And people could reach out to you through your website, follow your Facebook page, so you have a LinkedIn page. So yeah, definitely really appreciate your time and availability to help people out as they need it.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed the conversation.